Hello, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. We're very excited to have you joining our session, Toxic Prisons, Environmental Racism, and Incarceration. My name is Faith Taylor. I'll be the moderator for this session. I'm currently a rising second year PhD student at Yale University School of the Environment. Our esteemed panel is Autumn Redcross, the director of the Abolitionist Law Center, BP Lyles, lead organizer from the Toxic Prisons campaign of the Human Rights Coalition, David N. Pello, he's the director of the Global Environmental Justice Project at University of California, Santa Barbara, Ufuma Ovian Mada, sorry, oh my gosh, I butchered that. She's a PhD student at the Space Enabled Research Group at MIT Media Lab. And we have Richard, a grassroots community organizer from the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons. And just to give a little bit of overview about our session, the United States has the largest prison population in the world and the highest per capita incarceration rate. According to the NAACP, 32% of the US population is represented by African Americans and Hispanics, compared to 56% of the population incarcerated being represented by African Americans and Hispanics. And while the 13th Amendment protects against the cruel and unusual punishment, most prisons are at maximum capacity, feature inhumane conditions, and exploit labor. Additionally, prisons do not have proper measures in place to adequately address states of emergency during the COVID-19 pandemic, has laid bare the injustices of the US carceral system, with the 5 largest known clusters of COVID-19 being inside correction institutions. Furthermore, many prisons are built on or near environmental hazards, including contaminated waste sites, and incarcerated individuals are frequently exposed to chemical contaminants due to sewer issues. In the session, the panelists that I introduced will give 15-minute presentations on the connections between environmental justice, racism, and the US modern carceral system. They will discuss the impact of toxic prisons on health and the quality of life for incarcerated individuals. And then finally, the panelists will discuss the movement against toxic prisons and alternatives that are more in line with environmental justice principles and human rights frameworks. So I'm very excited to be a part of the session, to hear from our esteemed panel. And while our panelists are presenting, feel free to use the comment section to put questions for our panelists. If there's a certain panelist that you would like your question to go to, you can put their name first and then the question, so that when we do the Q&A after all the presentations, I have a better sense of where to direct the questions. But we're looking forward to engaging with the panelists, also engaging with our live audience. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And our first presentation is going to be from Autumn Redcross and BP Lyles.
Thank you so much. We're extremely happy to be here with you all, the rest of the panelists and those who are tuning in today. And we hope to give an engaging presentation from our perspective. My name is Autumn Redcross, and I'm with the Abolitionist Law Center. The fullness of my title is Movement Building Director of Organizing and Advocacy. I'm the founding director of the Court Watch program there. And I definitely want to say that I'm not the overall director, who is Robert Salim Holbrook. And he's with the Abolitionist Law Center, which is a merger of the ideas between organizing and legal work or litigation. So my entry into this presentation is talking about where we come in terms of the legal work or litigation that has been brought forward by the Abolitionist Law Center. And the Abolitionist Law Center came about through HRC, the Human Rights Coalition, which is a group of community members of people who are both inside and outside the prison. This group came together to relieve one another's stresses, support and uplift one another, and advocate for the human rights of people inside. And we, together with the HRC, are working towards closing, actually, SCI Fayette, because abolition is in our title. This is our goal. We're a decarceral project, though, and we're looking to go against the systems that hold incarceration across the United States. In about 2004, SCI Fayette was constructed. So it's a sort of new prison. And it came into our purview because we have people there. And in 2013, ALC filed a comment and published a report about the toxicity of SAI Fayette. See, it's sitting on a collection of coal waste, about 40 million tons of coal waste and 2 coal slurry ponds and millions of cubic yards of coal combustion. And as you can imagine, it's a problem for the people who are living within that facility. And with that report, which received a lot of reporting on, it received a lot of attention, um, we were able to see or show that about 81% of the people inside who responded to a survey that we put forward reported respiratory, um, throat, sinus conditions, shortness of breath. There are also reports of gastrointestinal problems, including heartburn and stomach pains, diarrhea, ulcers, ulceritis. There were reports about skin conditions, including painful hives and reactions, cysts, abscesses. And so bringing that to the forefront and speaking out about it led to us being able to stop the dumping of the site, the dumping of coal waste onto the site or nearby the site. And although it could restart at any time, it's sort of on hold for now. And we always keep in mind the end goal, and the end goal is actually to close the prison doors. At this point, we are glad that the dumping has stopped because with it, a lot of the reactions, of course, have stopped. But we are always standing by, prepared to move in case something were to restart again. And with this understanding and information, we were able to be a part of actions to keep or prevent USP Letcher from opening, which was the idea of opening a prison in Kentucky. Um, the people there, people of Letcher County actually approached the Bureau of Prisons there and wanted to do this with their money because building prisons is a economic high point for some. But we were asked to get involved with trying to stop it. Of course, the plans were to put $44 million property site and open this new federal prison. It would have gone on top of a former coal mine in Kentucky there. And there was also an active coal mine with coal sludge and a pond again. And this was the idea that they would construct a prison there. But we filed a litigation saying that the plaintiffs were people inside the prison, and they should be allowed, according to NEAP regulation, to know about the risks associated with the construction of this prison because they hadn't formally been. The normal way of doing things would be to create an investigation, offer out a report that talks about the impact of a prison being built in the area, and then collect comments. It was very problematic that federal prisoners, were not given this information, and that was an easy argument to target the campaign to build this prison. And so what ALC did, or members of ALC did, was they folded in all the comments that were contrary and investigative reporting that was contrary to the building of this facility, including noticing that the building of this facility in this particular space would be threatening to various endangered species. In fact, there were 3 types of endangered bats that would be affected. And there was little to no necessity for the prison to be built. The Bureau of Prisons had reported that the population of the prisons in Kentucky had declined by 20 to 30,000 people. And so it was the Bureau of Prisons who also decided to rescind the request for the $444 million because they noticed an incline or an increase in costs that would be associated with building this prison because of all the comments and to satisfy the environmental needs that they would need to in order to build, I guess, a better prison. So ultimately, because of our work against it, because of the way social media was used, the reporting on the site, people's concern, some's refusal actually in Letcher to use their land for the building of the prison, um, it folded. The entire proposal folded, and we were able to withdraw our filing because it rendered our filing moot. But the takeaway, and you can go on to the next slide, is that these prisons cost millions and millions of dollars. I should say billions, as BP has corrected me earlier. And it's just amazing and confounding to see people so interested in racial capital that they're willing to risk lives and torture people and devastate our lands because of it. And there are a couple different ways that we approach the idea of toxic prisons, right? We think about prisons, actually, is the next slide back, and then we could go back. We think about prisons and in their structure, the danger that they have to people who live inside of them. So we're thinking about the physicality of the prisons, the water that's being dispersed throughout the prisons. We're thinking about peeling paint. We're thinking about all these awful, toxic possibilities, right? We could also think about building prisons and how it occupies space and the land that it takes up and what it does to the detriment of the land as an environmental concern. And one thing that I did not touch on is the way we think about the way our, I'm forgetting the word, but how climate is changing and the climate has an effect on prisons. We can also go backwards and think about the development of our prison state, right? And we know that prisons were made to be a reform. We know that prisons are another form of slavery, in fact. But what we really want to talk about now, and I'm handing it over to BP, is the systemic environmental factors that are extremely problematic.
Thank you so much, Autumn. Let's go to the next slide. So when we think about the systemic process, right, the painful, destructive impact of prison life, of the carceral system in this country, let's think about it from a number of perspectives. The implicit structural impact is that we locate little communities of people inside of agrarian areas, right? And we build these structures in areas that are highly populated by a small number of people that unfortunately have difficulty finding employment through any other means really than working at a prison or a jail. So structures come in, and then you have a financial infrastructure that is brought to towns that are small, that are often rural or agrarian, and where people, again, cannot find work doing much else. So you have this going on. You have the development also of an entire economic system. Jobs come in, restaurants are built, right? Money is provided to that area from federal and state municipalities and governments, because now the bodies of Black bodies are now being counted as residents in these towns. And so the amount of money that they get increases. Now you have also something that Autumn and I discussed earlier, is that you have a lot of bodies now working for no money. I spent time in Fayette in LaBelle, PA. And during my time there, I worked for anywhere from 19 cents an hour to 42 cents an hour. Jobs that, if were worked outside of the confines of a prison, would make anywhere from $17 to $35 an hour. So you have great labor at literally pennies on the dollar. And so while that's going on, we have also the concerns that they're making all of this money on our bodies. Next slide. They're making all of this money on bodies. They're bringing bodies into these places, and what they're not really doing is managing healthcare. They're not managing healthcare. So while incarcerated, you have people that deal with basic kinds of sicknesses and illnesses, common colds, allergies, things of that nature. And when incarcerated, you spend $5 to go down to the infirmary to see a nurse or a doctor, and you often get confronted with the idea that you are either lying about being sick, or they tell you to order some pill or some cough medicine off of commissary, all of which lack the active ingredients that allows the medication to be helpful against the sickness you bought it for. So there's no active ingredient. You paid $5 to go to a nurse or to a doctor that have told you we're not going to do anything for you. Then you spend more money on commissary for a product that is impotent in producing anything that you need it for. Okay, so that's going on. I have a friend of mine who was in Fayette, who suffered with a respiratory problem for 2 years. They would not give him any medication that it would actually work. He felt like he might die because it was affecting his lungs. He comes home, he goes to a common drugstore, he picks up something off the shelf, and within a week or two, the problem is gone. Problem is gone. I know people that have died from cancer there because going to the infirmary didn't really produce any good results. And so those infirmaries don't take care of you until you're at the very last stages. So these are things we really have to be concerned about. My personal belief is that they tend to hire people that are just about ready to have their license revoked. And it's like the DOC says, no, don't take their license. We'll take them. And so that's how that tends to go on. And then we have the challenge of, we have 1 minute, of solitary confinement, which is a gross way to isolate people that are already isolated. And so as you see there, these restrictive housing units, or what we call solitary confinement, formerly known as the hole, there is such emotional and mental and psychological trauma that impacts the way people are able to adjust back, whether that is to adjust back to population inside of the prison, or we're talking about the larger challenges that people have in adjusting back into society. And so while there's not time, let me just end on this. Let's push now to reentry. In reentry, here's the ask. The ask is that people in society understand that more than 90% of all people that are incarcerated have a date to return home. What people need upon returning home: decent housing, livable wage earning jobs, and they need to become independent enough that they're not the threat on them economically or socially that would promote a committal of either a new crime because they can't survive, or their former crime because that's what gets them the money in order to survive. So we need to be sure that in our communities, we make an impact by embracing, opening our hearts, opening our arms, and knowing that we need to welcome people home.
Thank you. That was a amazing presentation. Really blown away, especially with the comments about people returning. And I think that the carceral space, as a lot of people commonly conceive it, people are just there, out of sight, out of mind. But most people return home, and especially with these environmental injustices, they follow people post their time incarcerated. So it's really important that we think more comprehensively about incarceration. So I'm really grateful that you touched on that, and also bringing up being prison populations being counted, and also a lot of prisons, like, they don't give people the right to vote, so they're being counted in these districts, and they also are lacking their basic human right, like the U.S. allegedly believes in human rights, the basic human right to be able to participate in the democracy that we have. So being counted, but not being able to participate. So just really good for our discussion. And our next presenter is going to be David.
All right, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful, thank you so much. I want to first begin by acknowledging that where I live, work, and recreate is on unceded, ancestral, traditional, indigenous Chumash territories. And I want to thank the Chumash community for giving me the opportunity to rebuild relationships of trust, respect, and reciprocity. Next slide, please. I'm really glad to hear from Dr. Red Cross and BP. I'm going to be building on that in many ways. They really laid it out so well. I want to focus on the linkages among incarceration and public health and environmental justice. And I want to argue that mass incarceration is really anathema to the pursuit of public health and environmental justice, because carceral systems are inherently anti-ecological, and they produce illness and disease within and beyond the walls of confinement. So in other words, as BP and Autumn have laid out, prisons are toxic in the sense that they just inherently produce harm and illness as a matter of course. And then I want to consider how incarcerated folks and formerly incarcerated folks and their allies are mobilizing to articulate these linkages, to promote abolition, to promote public health and environmental justice for all. Next slide, please. So prisons are bad for our health. In the book, A Plague of Prisons, Ernest Drucker argues that contemporary mass incarceration really exhibits all of the classic hallmarks of an epidemic. And we know what that looks like. We're living through it right now. Rapid growth rate, large scale, and self-sustaining properties. And so incarceration negatively impacts not just the folks who are behind bars, but entire families and communities. We know, for example, that children who have incarcerated parents are at least 6 to 7 times more likely to be incarcerated later in life, and they have lower life expectancies than the rest of us. So Ernest Drucker really contends that prisons behave like an infectious disease, and that even for those who enter prison young and healthy, like Richard Mosley, who spent some time at SCI Fayette, a prison sentence could be tantamount to being afflicted with a chronic illness or long-term disability. During his decades in Angola prison, next slide, please. Former Black liberation activist and political prisoner Albert Woodfox, may you rest in peace, my brother and elder, he wrote, quote, "I never went to the hospital because unless it was absolutely necessary. Medical treatment at Angola was, as it is at all prisons, deplorable. There are long delays, bad doctors, and a lot of misdiagnoses in prison hospitals. At Angola, aspirin was given for everything. And a lot of times for cuts and bruises, I used an old remedy my grandmother taught me, my own saliva. It worked well to speed healing," end quote. So as we've heard, healthcare quality and access have long been flashpoints for the incarcerated, who frequently include demands for improvements related to this subject matter in prison strikes and lawsuits. Next slide, please. For example, a week and a half prior to the historic uprising at the Attica prison in New York State in 1971, the incarcerated folks in A Block decided to engage in a mass sick-in to call attention to the dire state of the prison's medical facilities. When the uprising was in full force a week and a half later, incarcerated folks wrote a list of demands to the authorities for improving the prison environment, which included, quote, provide adequate medical treatment for every inmate, engage either a Spanish-speaking doctor or interpreters will accompany Spanish-speaking inmates to medical interviews, end quote, thus linking environmental justice, health, and language justice. Now, there are numerous cases where the state has sought to amplify the medicalization and criminalization of incarcerated folks, particularly women, queer, and gender nonconforming folks of color, by constructing special facilities to control these bodies. But fortunately, grassroots movements continue to fight back, winning battles to even prevent the construction of such facilities, similar to what Dr. Redcross was talking about with USP Letcher over there in Kentucky. Next slide. For example, on October 1st, 1977, as demonstrated in this powerful book by Emily Thuma, we saw nearly 1,000 demonstrators protesting plans to open a center for so-called quote-unquote violent women at a state mental hospital in Worcester, Massachusetts. This action was led by the Boston-based Coalition to Stop Institutional Violence, which created a broad, multi-issue, intersectional activist network that successfully prevented this facility from being built in the first place. Next slide, please. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic has brought into stark relief the many ways in which what we call health disparities across demographic groups have been further amplified within carceral spaces. And so since the start of the pandemic, at least 93% of the folks incarcerated at this prison, the federal prison at Lompoc in Santa Barbara County, my county, have contracted this disease, which made the prison the #1 pandemic hotspot of any prison in the United States and one of the largest known COVID clusters in the US. Carceral spaces, of course, have been hotspots for COVID-19 for a number of reasons, some of them obvious, right? The fact that physical distancing, which is necessary to reduce or prevent transmission of the virus, is basically impossible because of the overcrowding that occurs in these close quarters, which is intentional and by design. Second, despite the so-called constitutional guarantee of adequate medical care for incarcerated folks in the US, the quality of such care is substandard, also by design. And third, of course, an overwhelming percentage of imprisoned persons have pre-existing medical conditions like hypertension, diabetes, asthma, all of which are largely produced and certainly exacerbated by structural racism, which then heightens their vulnerability to additional health risks like COVID. So here in FCI Lompoc, we find sick men being isolated in a mothballed section of the prison that had previously been used as the whole. In other words, the COVID-19 treatment and recovery unit, such as it is, used to be the solitary confinement unit, a place of inherent violence, layers of violence on top of other layers. One prisoner there reported that he could hear men coughing into the common area through their cell bars and said he listened as the guards rushed to one prisoner's cell and said he was, quote unquote, gone. I can't believe this is happening in the United States, he said. It was like watching a horror movie. Now, a number of folks who are currently and formerly incarcerated at this prison, Lompoc, wrote letters of protest to various authorities detailing the conditions of this facility and the mistreatment that they have experienced during the COVID-19 pandemic, some of which included claims of medical staff withholding critically needed medicine. That's just happens every day. Physical and verbal assaults by corrections officers and case managers, check, happens every day. And a refusal by prison staff to wear protective masks, that's ongoing. A man named Omid is serving time here at Lompoc, where he also teaches GED classes. He actually wrote a letter of protest detailing the horrendous conditions and the lack of proper medical treatment there. And he shared it with the media, in which he stated, quote, "Once you are in this hellhole, you are at the complete mercy of the dysfunctional, apathetic, and irresponsible staff," end quote. Now, another incarcerated person there named Sean sent letters of protest to the acting assistant director of the Bureau of Prisons. He sent letters to his law firm that was representing him and to his US senator in a clear act of defiance. He also provided excruciating details of the mistreatment and medical neglect at the prison during the pandemic, including denying folks access to the option of home confinement, which was to be made available through the CARES Act, part of that big stimulus package for the COVID pandemic. Now, I want to briefly note that like other incarcerated folks at FCI Lompoc and carceral facilities around the world, the act of letter writing frequently entails speaking out about the injustices in these institutions, which constitutes an act of resistance and extraordinary courage because it puts one at great risk of retaliation by authorities. Anthropologist Orasanmi Burton talks about letter writing by imprisoned folks as an act of survival and rebellion against the domestic warfare that the prison industrial complex constitutes. Extending that idea, I would contend that letter writing by formerly or currently incarcerated folks and their loved ones, their friends, supporters, and allies is also a critical act of environmental justice work, and that is key to abolition. Next slide. So in their book, Inflamed, Rupa Maria and Raj Patel articulate a framework that articulates the deeply interconnected nature of health, linking the human body, our societies, and the planet together. They demonstrate how illness within our bodies is directly connected to and reflects the harms facing our global ecosystems that are perpetrated and sustained by our political and economic systems. The ecological havoc that racial capitalism has wrought on our soil, on the water, on the air, on food and ecosystems has yielded parallel violence to humankind. So linking that idea with Ernest Drucker's approach to the prisons as a plague, we suggest that mass incarceration contributes to and constitutes an environmental injustice and a public health epidemic, and therefore any healthy and environmentally just society must also be an abolitionist society. And so in closing, I want to emphasize that because COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, meaning it spreads from non-humans to humans, its very existence reflects illness and harm that extends across species, necessitating a multi-species justice approach to public health and environmental justice. So COVID-19 is a form of environmental injustice because it involves the targeting of marginalized populations through biological warfare. Last slide, please. Addressing these challenges will require drawing on long-standing and emerging traditions and practices of care work that activists both inside and outside of carceral institutions have honed over the generations. As Dan Berger reminds us, prison organizing demonstrates the pursuit of freedom for violence is rooted in care and creativity. And as Rupa Maria and Raj Patel have issued a clarion call for reconstructing relationships of care and connections among humans and between humans and the natural world. So I will end there, and I thank you so much.
Wow, that was phenomenal. This has just been a great panel. I'm really excited. Thank you for touching on environmental justice being a multi-species issue. As a Black vegan, I think it's really interesting, especially with the carceral space, to see how a lot of the tools and techniques that we use to overpower and dominate animals, like keeping animals, non-human animals in cages, are also used as strategies of tools of oppression for Black and brown bodies. So I really appreciate that connection because all systems of oppression are very deeply intersected. And I also really appreciated the comment about letter writing as a form of environmental justice and just expanding like what justice can look like and like what does it mean to participate in liberationist and abolitionist ideas, and pushing that forward. So thank you so much for that dialogue. And then our next presenter will be Ufuma.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, my name is Ufoma. I'm a fifth-year PhD student at MIT in the Department of Aerospace Engineering. And I'm going to talk about my dissertation topic, which is opportunities, challenges, and limitations of applying satellite Earth observation technologies for environmental justice. And specifically, on the high level, my dissertation is exploring satellite data for EJ, which has been an underutilized tool in this space. But I'm exploring that through case study research of environmental injustice in the prison industrial complex as all these previous presenters have really set the stage for already. Next slide, and we can actually skip the next 3 slides. And next one. Cool, this one. Yep. Yeah, so Autumn did a really great job of talking about Fayette, which is built near 40 million tons of waste, coal slurry ponds, etc. It's really just a gross example of environmental injustice in prisons. In addition to these types of exposures, it goes beyond Fayette. According to a 2016 report by Paige Williams, at least 598 federal and state prisons are located within 3 miles of a Superfund site, with 134 of them just 1 mile away. And for those who aren't familiar, Superfund sites refer to land where toxic chemicals from factories or landfills were dumped for decades, polluting the surrounding soil, water, and air. Next slide. These hazards go beyond just proximity as well, though, as people have noted. Other environmental hazards that affect prisons, including flooding. On the left is an image of an institution, a correctional institution in Beaumont, Texas, that was inundated during Hurricane Harvey. In the middle is Rikers Jail, which is in the 95th percentile of proximity to hazardous waste in New York. And on the right-hand side is an image of the coal slurry pond that would have been approximately 1 mile from the proposed prison facility in Letcher County, Kentucky, that several folks alluded to earlier. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as you can see, and as we've discussed, there's a lot of different environmental hazards that prisons are exposed to. And I believe space technology can measure and support monitoring of these environmental hazards. Space technology can be used to examine air pollution, forecast and monitor extreme weather, map the aftermath of floods or wildfires, and more. And I'll briefly in the next slide explain kind of high-level principles of how remote sensing works. So remote sensing is the process of detecting and monitoring physical characteristics of the Earth using its reflected radiation. So what we're looking at here is the electromagnetic spectrum, and the energy is classified along the spectrum in different wavelengths, such as like infrared or visible light or microwaves. You may have heard those terms before. In the next slide. So basically what satellites do is they take the spectrum, and the sensors measure the energy within specific portions of the spectrum, and we call those bands. Next slide. Most common satellites usually have between 4 to 12 bands along the electromagnetic spectrum. So like one band might be the red band, another band might be near infrared, etc. Next slide. And by analyzing the energy reflected of a specific thing you're looking at in these different bands, we can then start to determine what features of the Earth we are seeing. So looking at this image, for example, if you look at the green line, that's vegetation. Vegetation has a very different curve of reflectance of energy than, for example, the red line, which is asphalt road. And this is also very different than the blue line, which is water. So this pattern and process is what we refer to as remote sensing, and how we're able to distinguish land cover classification from satellite imagery. Next slide. So yeah, in my dissertation work, I'm asking 2 questions. On a high level, what does Earth observation data reveal about the scale of environmental injustice in carceral geographies? And on a higher level, what are the opportunities, challenges, and limitations of applying Earth observation data to support environmental justice advocacy? So part of what I'm trying to ask with the second question is, sure, yeah, I think environmental or satellite data can likely see some of these relevant environmental hazards, but why might that be difficult? And what are the limitations of what it can see in order for actually achieving environmental justice in these landscapes? Why might it be challenging for people who are advocating to actually use this data and operationalize it? Next slide. So I'll talk about an example of how Earth observation data might be applicable to this fight for environmental justice in prison landscapes. So looking at a case study of Hurricane Harvey. So if folks recall, Hurricane Harvey was in 2017 with peak dates between August 25th and August 29th. And during Hurricane Harvey, while most businesses and residents were evacuating, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and the Bureau of Prisons decided not to evacuate 4 prisons containing 8,000 people. Accounts from people collected by the National Lawyers Guild documented conditions such as cells flooded knee-high with water contaminated by urine and feces. And the Texas Department of Criminal Justice denied these accounts, saying, oh, we just visited the facility, there's no flooding around it, nothing happened. So I wanted to see if I could use satellite data to counter this story from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. Next slide. And so in this red square, this is the Styles unit, which is located in Beaumont, outside of Houston, Texas. And you can skip the next slide, go on to the next one. And one more slide, thanks. Cool, so to approach this question of whether or not I can see flood inundation, I used 2 different methods, or specifically 2 different satellites. One satellite is called Sentinel-1, and it measures radio waves. And this satellite comes from the European Space Agency. It's freely, the data is freely available to use. And then this second satellite is called PlanetScope. And this is an optical imager, meaning that it takes images in the visible part of the spectrum. And this comes from a commercial satellite company called Planet. And so their data does cost money, but as a student, I was able to access it for free. But this is an example of one of those potential barriers to actually operationalizing satellite data. Next slide. So the first approach I'll talk about is using PlanetScope. Next slide. So the method I'm using is something called the Normalized Difference Water Index. So again, if you recall earlier, when I was explaining that satellites have different bands of the electromagnetic spectrum that they measure energy in. And it's these, and different types of landscapes will reflect differently across those different bands. So this image is showing how, for example, water has a very flat signature in RGB as well as near infrared, whereas something like vegetation has a very different curve that is really high in the near infrared. Similarly, water will have a different signature than something like roads or et cetera, et cetera. And the specific formula for the index is on the right-hand side. So it's specifically looking at the difference between the green band and the near infrared band. Next slide. Something I'll caution, and you'll see in the imagery that I'll show you next, is that this index is actually known for misclassifying buildings and shadows due to the roofs, the flat roofs of buildings having a similar type of reflection as flat surfaces of water. So that's just something to note, but it's knowing that going in, you can know where the actual buildings are from other imagery and discern what is water presence versus what is building. So next slide, I'm showing just a normal image of the Styles unit taken aerially. And then in the next slide, I'm showing 2 different images from this PlanetScope satellite. On the left-hand side is an image from August 24th, 2017. So this is before Hurricane Harvey landed in Beaumont or in Houston as well. And I'll note with this index NDWI, what you'd expect here is for the brighter green in this imagery to indicate the presence of water or to suggest that the presence of water. Again, I'll note, as I mentioned, it misclassifies buildings, which is why you can see that the buildings are showing up very bright green. On the right-hand side is an image from September 2nd, 2017, which is just after the rain had stopped, but there was still some presence of flood in the area. And as you can see, just visually, there's these are on the same scale, and there's much more density of the bright green in and like around directly around the facility. Obviously, with satellite data, we can't penetrate a building to see what's going on in here. But the idea is to be able to use data to build a narrative around what's going on around the immediately surrounding environment of the facility, so that we could better understand what might have been happening in the facility as well. And so we can assess the presence of water by looking at the difference between these two images. And this is a process known as change detection. I'll show that in the next slide, please. So here, change detection is showing, like I said, the difference between that after and the before image. So this just helps us to really highlight areas that changed. And you can see it actually dampens down the buildings because the buildings are being misclassified in both images. So it just ends up kind of zeroing out. And what you end up seeing is in the blue cyan color, really bright areas where that are indicative of significant change in water presence between those two dates. And so this is just one way that we can start to build understanding of what was going on in the immediately surrounding environment. Now I'll show the second approach in the next slide. And this is using the Sentinel-1 synthetic aperture radar data that measures radio waves that I mentioned. I'll explain in a few slides how that works, but first I wanted to know a challenge that I immediately faced with trying to use the satellite. So Sentinel-1 is said by the European Space Agency to image everywhere on the Earth every 12 days. And in my previous work, I've really never faced issues getting the data I need in the time that I need. However, upon trying to obtain data for the Styles unit during the peak Hurricane Harvey dates, I ran into an issue. Next slide. So these red rectangles are showing the flight paths of the satellite and where it planned to image between July 2017 and September 2017. Again, the peak of Harvey was August, late August. And if you look toward, I know it's kind of hard to see, but if you look towards the right of the image, or right of the label that says Houston, you'll see a yellow dot. Next slide. That yellow dot is the Styles unit. And these red rectangles, again, these are the planned areas that it's observing. The Styles unit is directly outside of those planned observations. And it was for, this is a time period of 36 days. Again, despite that it's supposed to image everywhere every 12 days. And what I found from just kind of running into this challenge is that some areas just are not being prioritized. It may not be intentional neglect on the part of whoever's designing these missions, but for one reason or another, the Styles unit is not a priority for imaging. And this presents, this hints at my, what I'm trying to show with my dissertation of how satellite data, it might be useful, but it may not be accessible. It may not be obtainable for the communities that actually need it the most. Next slide. I'll show you what I did try to salvage from using this method though. So the before image I'm using is July 31st, and then the after image I'm using is from September 5th. And next slide. So briefly, how radar imagery works is it beams radio waves down to the Earth, and it measures how much of that radio wave is reflected to the sensor. You can pay attention to just the left image here. Basically a smooth surface or something like water, it's going to reflect the light such that the sensor doesn't see any of the energy. So typically in radar imagery, something that has water presence will end up looking really dark in the imagery, as you'll see in the next slide. So these dark areas are areas that we're thinking are likely water because of that property of radar imagery. Next slide. So doing a similar process of change detection of the after image minus the before image, I can then isolate pixels as shown in the cyan, bright blue color of areas that were likely inundated with water. And I'll note that this image was 5 days after the peak rain had ended. And so, you can imagine if I had an image that was during the peak time, how much worse that this might have looked. You can skip the next slide. So yeah, I'll close here, which is to say, Yeah, I'm showing in my work how I'm trying to build quantitative evidence of environmental injustices happening around prison facilities. My work is going to go beyond flood inundation, although that's what I showed today, to also look at effects from wildfires, extreme temperature, air pollution, and more. And next slide. And the ultimate aim is to show how satellite Earth observation can enable data-informed environmental justice activism. Thank you.
Great job. Thank you so much for sharing your doctoral work. I found your presentation to be particularly insightful as a young PhD student myself. And shout out to you for using an underutilized tool by the environmental justice movement. I think that's really important, especially when we consider that the early EJ scholars had a different project than what is the project of today's second wave of major EJ scholar activists. So being able to expand the types of tools that we have, accessing some data that might not be publicly available, and being able to synthesize that so that other people can utilize it. I think that the work that you're doing is absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I really appreciated it. And then our last speaker will be Richard. So if you want to take it away, Richard, and lead us out.
Sure. Want to apologize in advance that I did not send the PowerPoint, but I figured my name's Richard. I'm an abolitionist organizer with a campaign to fight toxic prisons. I figured it'd be more helpful in terms of developing our conversation if I just went through a few key points on some of the organizing work that the campaign to fight toxic prisons does, and use that as an intersectional piece to like better engage folks with discussions. Because I think ultimately from having panels like this and just like doing the research and being engaged in discussions, that these things lead to us doing the real grassroots level work to not only understand the system that we have, but also understand what we need to build to have infrastructure to dismantle it, and then bring about the real changes that will transform our communities. So to start with, definitely want to give a big shout out to Afoma for her dope presentation and just the dope work that she's doing using satellite data. It will definitely enhance a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do on the ground as organizers, and many of my comrades who are also involved in environmental issues at this intersection. So I'll briefly make a couple of comments about what Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons is, where we came from, and then a little bit about some of our organizing work that we've done in the past and how it intersects with topics for this panel. So first and foremost, the Campaign to Fight Toxic Prisons is directly centered at several intersections that we've already discussed today. So the intersection of environmental justice, liberation movements, Black and trans and queer movements, and prison abolition. So that's kind of like where the framework that we come from. That's a lot of what the framework that we use. And then I think Dr. Autumn and BP mentioned something that's essential to our work, this understanding on what toxicity is. When we're talking about toxicity of the prison system, we're talking about not just the toxicity that you talk on a typical basis. We clearly come at toxicity from an abolitionist perspective. Toxicity is endemic to the carceral system. And that was something that David also mentioned in his presentation. So this kind of has implications, not just for the framework that we use in terms of how we address the systemic issues that are endemic in the carceral system, but also in policies, procedures, and how we look at all those different facets of the world that we live in. So for us, toxic prisons are toxic not just as to like the environment, they're toxic to our communities, they're toxic to our well-being, they're physically toxic, psychologically toxic, environmentally toxic, and that includes the lands that they're built on. Many prisons are built on Superfund sites, not to mention the variety of different avenues, like where there's a whole bunch of academic concepts I could talk about in terms of describing like the necromancer and things like that, and necropolitics that describe the logic behind like where prisons are built. But I think like to break it down in real simple terms, much of the toxicity of prisons and the prison system comes because we have a carceral criminal punishment system predicated on disposability, disposing of people, disposing of communities, disposing of all those things, and is primarily centered on people of color and minoritized groups, and that leads to like one of like the grounding points for the campaign to fight toxic prisons, and that is that we're against all prisons in any form, in any shape, in any iteration. So there's no such thing as green prisons. All prisons are toxic under any condition. So that's kind of like one of the foundations for kind of like what we do. But another thing that's at the heart of the work that we do as organizers is centering our incarcerated comrades, allowing them to take the lead in understanding and leading the work that we do, allowing the communities that are most impacted by said conditions to take the lead in developing solutions to fight back against that. So in that vein, I wanted to read a poem from one of our comrades, Clinton Kichi Walker, on what he had to say about surviving toxic prisons. It is a burdensome task surviving toxic prisons, where the effect of the environment on a person's spirit is like acid dripping on an individual's flesh, searing the human qualities of a being. Policies and practices are constructed and saturated with inhumane substances that amplify toxicity. No inhabitant is unscathed. The result of merging toxo-ideology with prison structures inescapably manifests it's in unfair customs and exercises that take on many poisonous faces within the correctional system. These customs or exercises willingly become repeated practices that do more harm than help in the realm of rehabilitation. Solitary confinement is representative of one of these poisonous faces, where one is locked in a cell for 23 hours a day, suffering deterioration and distortion of the mind. The grievance system, a prisoner's main avenue of complaint within the DOC, is itself a poisonous contradiction. Instead of being a mechanism for protection and reassurance, it's used as a tool to permeate a sense of helplessness that derives from the magnitude of complaints, resulting in unfavorable outcomes. Absent of proper treatment and adequate housing, individuals who suffer mental illness are left to roam the careless walks of prison compounds, and more often than not are thrust into cells with untrained, intolerant individuals, creating unhealthy situations that have routinely proven to end in rape, injury, or death. The fact that prison guards are instructed to immediately order prisoners to remove their hat before stepping foot into a building, while proudly wearing their correctional hat in a display of superiority and dominance, is toxicosis. That act may seem minuscule in nature, yet it is properly weighs heavy on the antagonist scale. Behind the surface, we can see how it serves as a direct catalyst to the feelings of the worthlessness due to it being so minor. If one is not treated equally or fairly in terms of basic etiquette, then surely one can never be as such in the grand scheme of a thing. The elemental conditions in prisons in their own right are toxogenic in producing toxic components and poisons within the atmosphere. These elements breed emotional dejection, conjuring frustration at having to breathe spawn of black mold and dust-filled air. Asbestos is regularly found in the dark bowels of the most ancient of penitentiary structures, while its captives are made to drink under over-treated water out of necessity. The swarm of toxins allow no exception to the prison food either. It is a kind of service where one may find rodents, excretions on trays and utensils, roaches peppered on any given meal, and a mouthful of clotted milk if a mistake is made or of not sniff testing before consumption. Those acts are hostile to the psyche and harmful to the health. This poisonous atmosphere produced by the malignant activities within the DOC septics is constantly introduced into the quarters of men and women and capable of negatively inducing the psyche's antibodies, which protect the spirit of its captives. In sum, The prison system and its toxins produce depression, anxiety, dependence, destruction, hopelessness, helplessness, irritation, frustration, aggression, suicides, and many other nouns related to such. So many imprisoned men and women are forced to combat this toxin themselves while looking out of windows, searching the clear sky for freedom, wishing were that leaf, bird, or butterfly. They are forced to battle a toxic psychosis at the risk of losing their sanity and humanity. No human being should have to endure such an onslaught. No human being should have to suffer the brute fault if one is consumed by the toxic fumes. Being should suffer the brute fault if one is consumed by the toxic fumes of prisons and asphyxiation. When certain needs are not met, it's natural to survive in any way what is optional. It is an already dead person that will endure these elements or torture, and in themselves, no form of retaliation, destructive or otherwise. These words are written from wisdom and courage to be free of the bondage of toxic prisons, while in the face of overwhelming odds. This requires the personality and character which hardship which reveals. We must appreciate, care for, love, understand, and support the men and women who battle the toxic beast daily. We must do so not for praise, not for reward, not to deify, but to give strength and to rejuvenate those who are being battle tested. It's selfish to enjoy the benefits of the struggle without participating in the fight of the struggle. We are a community that will return to the community, and it must be the goal of the community to sustain our strong men and women that fight to the rise of the polluted ashes. So I say all that just to kind of provide a little context in terms of like how we center incarcerated folks in the work that we do. Don't have time to go into a ton of detail in terms of all the works that we've done over the last couple of years, but I will highlight that we are very much involved in the lecture campaign in terms of using environmental conditions, and specifically with the EJ 2020 project, getting the voices of incarcerated folks heard in the planning of environmental strategies that impact incarcerated folks, because typically they've been censored from those processes. Let me see. I'll briefly say like two other things, and then I think we can get a little bit more into like the Q&A. As an organization, Fight Toxic Prisons, when we responded it to environmental crisis or crises that directly affect incarcerated folks, we center our incarcerated comrades always. So they always lead the strategies. And for me personally, I've done a lot of work with my comrade, Bryant Arroyo, who's known for his legal work and fighting for environmental justice within the prison system. I think I can stop there, and then whatever other things folks want to comment on or have questions about, we can talk about that through the Q&A.
Thank you so much. That poem was very powerful, and I really appreciate you sharing the work of someone who is incarcerated and just really reminding us that that is where the work that we're all interested in needs to be centered and focused, and allowing those voices to be present in a panel session like the one that we have today. So forever grateful that you were able to share that moment with us, share that person's work with us, so that we can sit with it, reflect on what their experiences are, and really hear firsthand from their own words and how they're reflecting on their experiences. And I really like that it was also a poem, because I think also just when we're talking about environmental justice and like what liberation will look like, I think that sometimes we shy away from seeing like artistic forms of expression as forms of liberation and forms of justice. So using art and poetry and other methods to express yourself and move towards abolition, and see poetry as a form of abolition in itself, especially in a space like this. So I'm glad for that. I'm very grateful for your presence today. So let's get into the Q&A with the time that we have left. So I'll start with the questions that I see in the chat. The first question is from Wayne, and it reads, can you speak to the congressional redistricting due to prison populations? I believe that BP, you were speaking about that early in our session. So if you wanted to touch on this question. Oh, you're muted.
Please forgive me. I have a system that allows my calls to be played in the house. Please forgive me. So, the economic system that occurs because of incarceration, I talked about small towns increasing their economic strength as a result of housing black bodies. You then highlighted the importance of knowing that those bodies, while incarcerated, add to the economic strength of these communities, while they themselves have no power to influence where the money goes or how it is spent or where it impacts, right? So let's think about what it means for this economic disparity in society and communities. So it costs somewhere between roughly 35 and, depending on your health, up to 80 something thousand dollars a year to house an incarcerated individual. Meanwhile, to rent a decent apartment for that same year, the average cost is roughly $9,000 to $10,000, right? If you move up and look at some of the more expensive apartments, we're talking maybe $16,000 to $17,000 a year to rent an apartment. So just looking at that, the basic cost of housing is nearly triple or more what it costs to have an apartment. Then we speak about the fact that healthcare is limited and next to nothing in prison. Meanwhile, people get a much higher grade of healthcare, whether they are on public health assistance or whether they are employed to such a degree that they can engage in the medical care of their company. What we need to do as a community is to recognize the impact, the financial impact that keeping people in prison, the negative financial impact that keeping people in prison has. But then we need to think about how destructive and damaging this ongoing labeling, this ongoing ostracizing of American citizens is when people return. So I returned in 2020. Society no longer believes that I should have access to decent housing, that I should have access to good employment. For most people, what that leads to is a depression that has already been created, if not furthered, while incarcerated. People return home, they run into wall after barrier after stumbling block trying to find work, and they give up. It induces in them this desire to just stop, to quit looking, but they still want to live. And so people live, that means they're going to either recommit the same crime or commit a new crime. Right. So there we're talking about the psychosocial impact of incarceration and what it means to have a necessity, a need to bring people back into society and to welcome people back. So how does that happen? Part of what has to happen is we have to help through legislation tear down the walls and the barriers. But legislation is not going to be enough. We have to impact people's minds and cause people in society to understand that they are adding to recidivism every time and every day that they spend fighting against returned citizens having access to decent housing, good jobs, and moving forward with their lives, having the right to vote, having freedom enough to move about in the earth. As long as we fight and stand against that, we are adding to recidivism, and we are really helping to further create and to further promote this limitation.
Oh, thank you for that response. And I do want to put this out into the universe that post incarceration, it's not free, like to stay in a halfway house. If you end up on house arrest or any form of governmental supervision, you're, as the formerly incarcerated person, are paying for that. And it can be very expensive and often results in people violating their parole, their probation, and then being sent back to being incarcerated because they just simply cannot afford to to pay all of the fees that are associated with just trying to get your life started back up. So there's a lot of barriers that are a part of the carceral space that follow you post-incarceration. And that's not even touching on the discrimination in the workplace, even though discrimination is allegedly a violation of human rights. It's legal to discriminate against formerly incarcerated persons, and many jobs that they were performing while incarcerated, they are then ineligible to perform as a result of their former incarcerated status once they are no longer incarcerated. And then this next question is for Mfuma. Did you use unsupervised ML for this, or was this area of interest small enough to do it manually? I'm not sure what ML is, so if you could also keep us in touch with terminology.
Yeah, so for sure, yeah. So great question. So ML is machine learning, and unsupervised machine learning refers to a process of classifying something without using training data, whereas supervised machine learning would use training data. I actually haven't. This was just kind of some initial explorations of how I might be able to use this, what methods might be stronger, which ones might be weaker, such as, finding out that like the Sentinel-1 approach may not be as strong. However, my next step would actually be to use supervised machine learning to feed in training data of what areas I'm visually identifying from like the NDWI thing that I showed that are likely water, to improve the classification of water presence over the area. But yeah, thanks for the specific and interesting question.
Thank you. I appreciate the definition of terminology. And then our next question is, can someone speak to the intersectionality between socioeconomic depression, including poor whites, and prison abolition? This would be an opportunity to build alliances and meet the goal of abolition. And even though I'm not on this panel, I think this is a really important question. And Richard also addressed, when he was talking, like green prisons are still places of injustice, because you do see like the greenwashing of prisons. And one interesting thing that I always find about the carceral space is that, like, when you look at like Appalachia, right? After the end of like mining and a lot of people's incomes being associated with mining, switching to like this green revolution and not wanting to use fossil fuels has resulted in a lot of those areas becoming solely, almost entirely funded by the carceral space. So instead of mining, you now see prisons as the largest employers in these spaces. So when we're talking about things like a just transition, right, between fossil fuels, carceral spaces are being used to fill that gap and employ hundreds, thousands of people within a community. So, and those are like in Appalachia, at least, like white, poor communities that are now entirely reliant on Black bodies being funneled into their carceral spaces to maintain employment. And Richard, since you are on
I wanted to mention two things on that. I really wish I had time. That's a great question. I really wish I had time to get into some really good depth on that particular aspect. But for sure, Dr. Autumn knows about this too. Like a lot of the work that we did in Letcher County, and it's also the work that Fight Toxic Prisons has recently done in Alabama. It's been situated in rural Appalachian area. Oh, Alabama's in Appalachia, but it's been rural poor areas. I'm not a geography teacher. It's been situated in rural places where like it's not just Black folks. Although Black and brown folks are the intended targets, it's impacted everybody. And the Alabama campaign and that we've been working on the last 2 years has been a very good example of that, because in Alabama they proposed to build two new mega prisons in Elmore County and in another county I'm forgetting right now. But the majority of the folks there were rural white folks. But we were able to get in with like both like liberals, conservatives, all folks who had a vested interest in that prison not being built on there. So even though like not everybody who worked on those campaigns were on the same like level politically, because we have people from all forms on the spectrum, like in the Communities Not Prison Coalition. We were all in agreement in not building these new prisons in those areas, and that's because of the impact that it had on the communities. We're able to and to answer that second part about prison abolition, for me, as we think about what does it mean to be a prison abolition and what it means to be an abolitionist, we've got to expand the conversation on where abolition goes towards, understanding the deep roots that it has within our communities, but also understanding that the carceral state, racialized capitalism is actually, as David was pointing out, it's detrimental not only for Black and brown folks, it's detrimental for everybody. It's in all of our best interests to work on the dismantling of these systems of oppression. And that means we're going to have creative conversations with different groups and people to see where our interests meet and then how we can work on some of those things together. Because even though we're not going to agree on everything, we can create certain points of unity. And that's where this intersectionality bit comes from. Those intersectional levels of oppression, sometimes based on economics, but other factors as well. We bring those things together and then we work towards the things that are going to heal and benefit our communities the most. All right, end the spill. Not bad, y'all. I get really excited when I talk about those things, but abolition works is a really good example of those intersections.
Yeah, if I can jump in here very quickly and just say that many of the questions that we have about this, we already have the answers to. So much of the work has been done. Much of the writing has been done. Many of these conversations have been had. At this point, we need to move from conversation to action. We understand the damage. We understand the decadence. We understand the destruction. Now we need to move to the promotion of health through action. And I think until we move from talking to doing, we are going to stay in this lethargy that has caused us to rot. So my desire is to promote us and push us past simple talking, and to cause us to access the power of the information that we already possess, and to incorporate now money, decisions, and the pen, or i.e. the keyboard, to make legitimate movements. And I think that part of what should happen as a consequence of this kind of symposium, this kind of movement, is to get people motivated to act. And so that's where my passion is, moving from talking to doing. And the people in power have the answers they need.
Facts, that part right there.
Have the checks they can write. And so now we need to get them motivated to act.
And if I could add, I appreciate the question and the two responses from Richard and BP. Very specific examples of what Wayne is getting at are contained in the Red Deal, which is the Red Nations, the indigenous response to the federal Green New Deal resolution, which says specifically we need to end policing, we need to end the prison industrial complex, and we need to transform our communities with that same energy into regenerative, just, and equitable and sustainable economies. The Green New Deal framework that we've created here in Santa Barbara does that exactly. We're looking to shut down the prison here, and we're not leaving people high and dry. We've laid out a plan for jobs in the cannabis industry, in the renewable energy industry, in the restorative agricultural industry, in our forests and our seabeds, our kelp forests as well, all of which have been devastated as a result of climate change. So those are real jobs, real economic development, real wealth that can be directed to folks who might be negatively affected by defunding the police, by prison abolition. That's exactly right. We should never forget that that's how we're going to get support.
Wow, this was an amazing conversation. I think that is all the time that we have today. And I just want to thank everyone for attending. And as we're moving forward in action, I think it's also important to, when we're talking about prison abolition, liberation, to think about other strategies for what does harm reduction actually look like? And what does it mean to have a decarcerated space? And how can we restore those who have been made whole by harm? And just overall, how can we each try to live a life that promotes harm reduction and reducing those barriers that create harm in communities, and making sure that all of our forms of liberation and justice are multi-species and inclusive. So like we said, so that no one gets left behind. And what it looks like, because people's livelihoods, unfortunately, are tied to the carceral space, people inside, outside, whole communities. So thinking comprehensively about how do we reduce harm for all parties who are entangled. And one thing we didn't touch on today is all of the health impacts associated with incarceral spaces also are experienced by the people who work in those spaces. So they have a vested interest in creating a healthier environment. It's not just the people who are incarcerated. Those places are occupied 24 hours a day by workers. So the workers are also experiencing tons of negative health impacts as receivers of environmental injustices and perpetrators of environmental injustice. So just overall harm reduction and thinking comprehensively. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us. I'm not sure if there's a way that we can give like at least my contact information if anyone would like to be in touch with me. My doctoral research also focuses on environmental justice and incarceration. But I'm available. It's just my first name last name at yale.edu if anyone would like to connect. And if anyone would like to connect with me, and then I can connect you with the panelist, I'm more than welcome to do that. I don't know if these chats are going to the large group. But thank you all so much for attending. This was amazing.
Thank you.